Hi, this is James Cook. I'm an associate professor of sociology in the University of Maine system. And as part of my work as a sociologist, I think about trends in describing social structure. One of these trends has to do with the term social network, and the second has to do with the term social capital. They're really different ways of understanding social structure, at least at a conceptual level, but they have ways that they interconnect. Both of these terms became really popular toward the end of the 20th century as two different social trends emerged. The first trend that emerged was one of thinking about ways that individuals interconnect, and that the patterns in interconnection really transcend psychology, which is essentially focused on what's going on inside a human in terms of emotions, wherever they lie, and cognitions, perceptions, and things like that. The United States is very individually oriented, but the social network ascendancy was based in no small part on the increasing complexity of society and the realization that the context of relations around individuals determined just as much, if not more, than the psychology that happened internally to individuals in terms of their lives. Social capital, on the other hand, is a term that emerged as a reaction to, first of all, economic capital as a way of describing drivers of societies, that really what we ought to focus on is money and economic value as a way of describing what's social. A reaction to that in the second half of the 20th century emerged first in understanding humans as having capital, that we build wealth up inside ourselves that we can then contribute to a society. And the term social capital was an attempt to essentially, within the social sciences, monetize relations, something that's clearly happened a lot in the 21st century. But the idea is that there is something about embedding an individual in a supportive relationship of others that can lend value to that individual as they attempt to do whatever it is that they're trying to do. Two kinds of social capital emerge. One kind of social capital is the social capital of obtaining information. When we try to obtain information, we're seeking out different sources of information from possibly far away. And in another kind of attempt to build social capital, we are trying to rely in a difficult situation on those we can trust. It turns out that trust and information connection are describing two different kinds of social structures. One that is bridging across difference, and another that is bonding within similarity. And that the two are in some ways social structures that can occur in our networks that are at cross purposes with one another. That is, a whole lot of bonding can be deleterious to being able to reach out far. And when we reach out far, often it is to those individuals with whom we might not have trust. So what I'd like to do in this video is to describe the relationship between those elements and bring them together in a cohesive way that's talking about capital, trust, and networks of connection. And then finally to describe trends in the United States itself, with the central element for that being the famous 2000 book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, in which he attempts to do some kind of civic sociology and say, is the capital that we have invested in our society eroding away as connections between individuals wither on the vine? One thing that has become clear as both social capital and social networks have become much more mentioned as determinants of social outcomes is the extent to which
they are interconnected. Social networks are built on two kinds of structure. The first is relation. We connect with one another through some form of interpersonal communication, in which a node is an individual unit that communicates, and a tie is communication, a relationship of some sort. If there are only two sorts of things that occur at that interpersonal level, it's a fundamentally simple model conceptually, but the complexity emerges through the patterns of interpersonal relations. One of the things that we know in sociology is that there's a second kind of structure, the structure of belonging to something larger than yourself, whether that's a civic organization or a church or a workplace or a school, any place where people get together and make connections with one another on the basis of shared identity, shared activity, belonging to something larger than themselves. Each of these can be thought of as a social circle. And in that social circle, identity is defined by belonging. Where does individuality come from? According to Georg Simmel in Die Kreuzung sozialer Kreise, or in English, the intersection of social circles, we get our answer. It is through membership in multiple associations, each of which brings identity, culture, expectation, sets of institutional or group knowledge, and together, a person is a combination of a number of those groups, a number of those associations. And there are so many associations all overlapping each other that we can have the appearance of individuality in a situation in which people are belonging to many groups. So networks and organizational overlaps create community together. They create a structure of social capital. And that capital is useful for individuals in finding information, in getting support when individuals need it. But for communities, social capital is also functional. It encourages trust and is therefore more efficient. It overcomes what's called the prisoner's dilemma, and it encourages generalized reciprocity, not just specific reciprocity. What do I mean by each of these? Well, trust, if we look at a number of literature reviews, I've linked to one here in a citation of Hoy and Chan and Moran in 1999, a pretty good literature review. They identify elements that encourage trust. And some of those are structural, even though they appear to be individual. Transparency of individual conduct and behavior and information. That is, do we all know the same information? Do we know what the other people are doing? And do we understand why? In order to establish that kind of transparency, you need to have an area of a network in which individuals can all see, understand, and monitor one another. Some part of a network that is tight. Reliability occurs as a consequence, partially, of transparency, but also through the understanding of regularities, right? Individuals in that situation where transparency and reliability occur also can be vulnerable, that is, put themselves open to being hurt. That's a possible cost, because they expect that they will not. They expect that others will be benevolent toward them. Where does benevolence come from? It comes from not having strange random actors come in and do strange random or not at all random but unanticipated things. Finally, trust emerges from a sense of competence in the group, that individuals know what they are up to, what they are doing, and why they are doing it. How does that occur? It occurs in a situation where individuals communicate those understandings with one another. They share the information that they have with each other, and they come to a common understanding of what ought to be done, who is to benefit and why, to whom are we benevolent, to whom do we extend our benevolence, to those within the group, and creating a set of regularities that accomplish that outcome of benevolence within the group, which is one understanding of what competence is. So trust is an aspect of a kind of a social capital in which individuals are tightly connected to one another, leading to the emergence of these features. It helps us to understand why the economic prisoner's dilemma is a structural abstraction that takes away from the reality that individuals can be embedded within, which is that of a community. The individualist economic calculus of a prisoner's dilemma is one in which you imagine two people who got caught committing a crime together, and they're taken to separate cells and they're interviewed separately. They can't communicate, and investigators are indicating that one of them is going to defect, one of them is going to betray the other, and will get a special deal, but only if they're the first one who does it. So the classic prisoner's dilemma is that if both individuals, both prisoners, know that they can trust the other, that they can rely upon them, that their partner is benevolent, and that is transparent so that they can engage in the vulnerability of possibly not self-serving, but holding back to protect the two together, right? It requires a sort of competence, doesn't it, in that pair? And what that requires is that we don't have this highly abstract situation of two criminals getting caught doing something together, clearly being partners together, but then put in separate rooms and not allowed to communicate. There was one time when I was in graduate school when I was encouraged to go to an economic lab and earn a little bit of money, about $20 or so, engaged in a series of environments in a computer lab in which we were supposed to experiment with the prisoner's dilemma. But the strangest thing occurred. What occurred was that over and over and over again, we refused to defect. We refused to take our individual reward, which would be smaller than a collective reward, but guaranteed, and we all stuck together, even though we weren't directly communicating with each other, in order to get that larger collective goal in which everyone wins. The economic experimenter was very frustrated with us and asked us, why did you do that? And what we said was, well, we came in the room and we saw the other people who were supposed to be interacting solely on other computers, and we recognized each other. We were all social science graduate students. And once we saw the instructions on the computer, we looked around at each other and we just connected face to face. And what we communicated without words was that we understood this was a prisoner's dilemma, and that we knew what the collective response was that would get us out. We all had spoken with each other. We were friends. We trusted each other. We were able to read each other. And we were able to get out of that prisoner's dilemma by cooperating even without words. So in a situation where individuals have a lot of connection with one another, where they are understanding and building trust through transparency, reliability, benevolence, mutual vulnerability, and competence in avoiding situations like the prisoner's dilemma, in those structural circumstances, you should expect people to be able to beat this individualist prisoner's dilemma, and instead of defections against one another, to form alliances of mutual aid. Another way that this has been put is in terms of reciprocity. Robert Putnam, in the first chapter to his 2000 classic Bowling Alone, identifies strains in social science research regarding reciprocity when people help each other. Specific reciprocity occurs when person A, let's say Alice, does something for B, say Bob, if Bob will give something back to A. It's a person-to-person trade. And it can work very well. You can negotiate just those two individuals, but the problem is those two individuals have to be able to help one another. Furthermore, if they're not in a situation where trust has been built, then the ability to successfully negotiate specific reciprocity goes away. Much more efficient is a situation of generalized reciprocity, where Alice does something nice for Bob, not with the understanding that Bob will then pay back Alice, but that Bob will do something nice for Clem. Clem will do something nice for Diana. Diana will do something nice for Ernie. Ernie will do something nice for Florence. And eventually somebody is going to go back to Alice and do something nice for them, because it's a general culture within a situation in which people help each other. There's benevolence, and that benevolence is reliable. People are vulnerable because they help others without expecting specific reciprocity in return. When does that happen? When you have units of local density in a network. Think about the difference between being in one of these bridges, one of these areas in which you're connecting different communities that don't connect to each other, these small dots here in this network, versus being in one of those clusters that you see here in the upper left, and then in the center top, center bottom, and lower right, where there are individuals who spend a lot of time all talking with each other. When we have areas of strong local density, everybody talks to each other, they're checking in with each other, they're building local cultures that are competent, transparent, and benevolent, they will help each other within those areas. Much less likely is that strength of strong ties to be extended to a set of people you don't know, that you don't interact with. And so in a network, local areas of density can find trust emerge within, generalized reciprocity to emerge within that cluster, but trust to break down across the clusters. Mark Granovetter, in his classic 1973 piece, The Strength of Weak Ties, identifies a second form of social capital, the strength of weak ties. What if relying on each other is great, building alliances and allegiance and generalized reciprocity is super within those clusters, but all of a sudden you need something that nobody in that cluster knows. Maybe you need to find a job, and you've done your job search locally, but you need someone else. What if you need to learn new information and to be educated? What will you do then? You have to go out beyond your local area of density. And it is at that point that the bridging social capital, the value of the bridge becomes evident, because these little connectors, these people who aren't embedded in any one group and who may not have built up trust, nevertheless may be conveyors of information, conveyors of new knowledge. And that kind of weak tie, which occurs when there are people in a social structure who don't connect well or thoroughly to others, can be valuable in its own way. But it comes at a cost. These are individuals who are caught between trusting communities, but they're left outside the zone of trust, outside the zone of benevolence. They can be used entrepreneurially to get valuable information, but they aren't likely to be welcomed into the clustering fold of a tight area of a network. And that trust within these zones of density, or the lack of trust outside those zones of density, have consequences. So Richard Wyke and Kathleen Holtzwart for Pew Research engaged in a study in which they first ask people whether they feel they can trust others. And we see here in this result from Wyke and Holtzwart that there's a lot of variation in that. There are some places where the presumption is that most people are trustworthy. China is one. Canada is another. Sweden is yet another. Places where large majorities agree that most people are trustworthy. And then there are places where most people don't feel that. Lebanon, Kuwait, Kenya, Czech Republic, Peru, Chile. All places where people feel that there's a lack of trust, where the institutions that bring people together in clustering, in folding them into little areas of a network where people rely on each other, just doesn't occur. And when that happens, when trust doesn't happen, then engagement in the generalized reciprocity of doing well to others, even if it doesn't directly benefit you, breaks down. So that when we talk about most can be trusted, when it's high, crime, it tends to be very low. But when trust is low, people perceive that crime is a big problem, that people are not holding up their end of a generalized reciprocity bargain in which people are benevolent to one another broadly. The same is true in this study regarding corruption, that in those places where people feel most can be trusted, they also perceive that corruption is not a large problem. Whereas where few people can be trusted, corruption is perceived as a large problem. So at the scale of very large social groups, entire nations, you have a relationship between the social structure of local areas of reliable density that cut down on crime and corruption. But you also have areas in which entrepreneurship might be necessary to get information from distant sources, and that might be easier, but in which you're going to have to be very canny about how you use that. Because if you are stuck in a situation where most of what you have is bridges, you're not going to be able to rely on many others that are around you. And that is, for Putnam and for other sociologists who study the presence of trust, reciprocity, bridging capital, and bonding capital. It is this highly contingent emergence of trust and useful information in different kinds of social structures and different locations within a social structure. So if that's the way that we understand the relationship between social networks and social capital, in terms of affiliation and connection and the patterns that we've learned to measure in this class, what are some known trends in social capital? Let's consider the empirical evidence, focusing on and extending just a little bit the work of Robert Putnam in his famous book, Bowling Alone. In doing so, I'd like to adopt
Putnam's distinction between Machers and Schmoozers. He uses Yiddish, which is related to German, which is this idea about making, doing. In Chapter 6, we talked about instrumental activity, task-related activity, versus schmoozers, talkers, emotional, expressively involved, people who are maintaining non-instrumental connections with one another. They're hanging out at bars, they're writing greeting cards to one another on their birthdays, they're inviting people over for dinner. Both are forms of activities, affiliations that build ties. Both create social capital. Both are important, and Robert Putnam, in the reading that you had for this week, tracked both. So, one of his strategies in this big book that you read is to go over and over and over again and say, let's try to build a case that there's been a decline in social capital. First, let's talk about it through the Machers, through civic engagement. Activities that are meant to do something to change the world for the better. Not just schmoozing, not just hanging out, not just getting to know people as friends, but accomplishing a task to make the world better. So he creates chart after chart after chart after chart to say, look, here's one kind of civic engagement, here's another kind of civic engagement, here's a third kind of civic engagement, and to try to show you that the general trend holds. However, if we look at some updated information, we might see a bit of a change. So a social science data network, data on voter turnout, for instance, finds that if you look at the year 1996, which was the last presidential election that Robert Putnam had experienced before he wrote this book and published it in the year 2000, before the 2000 election, you would see this declining trend for voting. But what's happened since then? Oh dear, it went up a little bit in 2000, it went up a little bit in 2004, up again in 2008, and this is among middle-aged people, who are the people that Robert Putnam says are the ones being lost, the middle years, right? And it was up again for that group in 2012. So it looks like there's some recovery there.
Looking at United States Census reports on voter turnout rates, we can see moving from that low point of 1996 when Robert Putnam publishes his book, continuing up through 2020, quite a resurgence. If you look at the orange line in this chart of census data, it's back above the 60% mark. Which is actually quite a strong rebound, if not quite to the 1964 levels.
Robert Putnam goes through in his figure 3 from this book. He talks about participation in campaign activities. It used to be, especially around 1970, 72 then, when there was a big presidential election year, 76, another big presidential election year, 1980, that people would attend political meetings, work for political parties, and then, boom, what happened? It started to drop off. His account for why that is that they're also not just not working for political parties, they're not attending speeches, they're not going to these activities on their own. It's replaced by paid staffers, paper organizations that consist of just a few people in an office who collect money from a lot of people but don't require their participation. Now, they may be very effective in getting policies changed or getting presidential candidates elected, but they don't involve people in a cause bigger than themselves in which they get to know one another and they form social ties that creates this feeling of trust when you know the people in a community, whether that's a geographic community or, in this case, a political community. So if there are more paid staff that are replacing civic volunteers, he shows in figure 7 something that looks good, which is the national number of nonprofit organizations per million people in the United States. It looks like it's going up, but these are paper organizations. They have no chapters, no meetings. They only want your money. Groups like the AARP, you don't show up for the American Association of Retired People to go to a meeting. And there are lots of other groups that are like that. Political action committees are like that. National Organization for Women is like that. You don't tend to show up for meetings. You just give them your donation and you move on. So he says the fact that these nonprofit organizations are increasing, these paper ones that have paid staff and just work off a large budget, is an indication that they're coming in to take on the role that used to be held by volunteer organizations. Our social capital is eroding, and so people with money are coming in and organizing on their own to fill up that space. The actual mean number of club meetings per year by people is declining, and that's a fairly convincing decline right there. Even informal activities, like writing a letter to your representative or your senator, signing a petition, it's not happening as much as it used to. This is figure 6. He shows overall that if you take a look at 32 national chapter-based associations from 1900 to 1997, that the mean membership rate in those organizations declines. This is a big figure. It's figure 8. It's in, we'll find it. It's on page 54. But I want you to be a little skeptical about this one. I want you to think about what that means. What are some of the groups that are talked about here, right? Groups like the Grange, groups like Odd Fellows. There's an Odd Fellows Hall in Maine that you can find. There's more than one, but can you find any actual Odd Fellows organizations? You might find a few that are left, but they tend to involve very old people because it's a very old organization. There's something that tends to happen to organizations. In 1900, they get founded. Now, the ones that Putnam studies are not the ones that get founded and then die. They're the ones that get founded and then persist and grow. The ones that died after 5 or 10 years, Putnam doesn't study. So that means that, of course, we're going to see an increase because those are the ones that Putnam is interested in. But what happens after a while to organizations, right? These 32 chapter-based organizations that are described in the chapter on civic participation, they tend to get old. They tend to ossify. They tend to shrink. They tend to fall away. Why? Because they're being replaced by new groups. There's liability of newness for an organization, that is, that new groups that form are likely to drop off, but there's also a liability of oldness, which is that old organizations tend to kind of fade away after a while. He's not studying different chapter-based associations, the popular ones in every decade. He's studying the ones that were popular back before the invention of the car or the television, back before people used electricity to a wide extent in their homes. That's a long time ago, with a different set of organizations. Temperance organizations are in there. So should we be surprised that these declined? Perhaps not. However, we can look at other kinds of declines. Now, this is an update on some of the data that he described, how often a respondent to the General Social Survey, the GSS, attends religious services. The red bars on the bottom indicate the percent who say never. That's gone up. In general, the percent that rarely or never attend has increased. Now, if you're not a religious person, you may not agree with the substance of religion, but despite the substance of religions, one of the things that a religious body does is it brings people together every week or maybe every month, and they get to know each other, they get to form social ties, They form that social glue. In a community, like a political community, this is a religious community in which trust can occur and people work together. Putnam does show that that declines. We can also see a strong decline in union membership. From 1900 to 1998, it's not as low as it was in 1900, keep in mind, right? But it has declined since the glorious 50s that Robert Putnam talks about. And if we extend that by looking at Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which is where Robert Putnam gets this information, the percent of employed people who are union members has further gone down. You might like unions. You might not like unions. That's not the point. The point is that whatever it is that unions do, something that you like, something you don't like, they do bring people together. They bring people together in meetings, they have them coordinate activity, they form social ties, they create that social glue that keeps people together and increases generalized reciprocity and trust and makes it easier for a society to go ahead and do the things it wants to do, whether they're union related or not. So that's fairly convincing. And so even if you have problems with one of the charts, and that chart on the 32, national chapter-based organizations, I do have a bit of a problem with, and other people do too. Robert Putnam does a pretty good job of saying, hang on, I have something else to show you, and to talk about the general trend. What about schmoozing? We talked about maching, the makers, the doers, the people who are striving for something you might agree with, something you might not. But then there's schmoozing. Schmoozers are these informal socializers. They're the people who hang out. They throw parties. They send cards to friends. They spend a night in the bar. You might like bars. Some of you do. Some of you don't. Some of you wrote in your response to the surveys that you never would go to a bar and you would underline it. Never, I would never. There's a moral element to that. But regardless of what you think of the moral element, one of the things that happens in a bar is that people socialize with each other. They schmooze. They form ties. Those ties can mean something later. Schmoozing acts like social glue too. And here we have one indication in figure 23 from the general social survey, by the way, of the percent who spend a social evening with someone who lives in your neighborhood. This is the percent about once a month or more from 1974 to 1998. Looks like a pretty big decline, doesn't it? Well, a fairly big decline. So it's a decline in neighboring. Well, okay. So if we spend less time with our neighbors, does that mean that we have weaker social glue? That's Putnam's argument. But I want to update this data, and I also want to point out that in the general social survey, this is only one question among a set of schmoozing-related questions. There's a question about bars. There's a question about friendships outside the neighborhood. Why hasn't Putnam included those in his graph? Well, in part because he included the one that up to the year 1998 or so, okay, in the general social survey, the one that looked like it had declined the most. Okay, I can't tell you about his motivation there, but if you actually look at the percent who say they spend at least one night a month with people in a bar, which is the lowest level, by the way, of all those other groups, schmoozing activities, it seems kind of steady, or maybe even going up a little bit. Not so much change over the last generation, is it? What about spending time with friends outside the neighborhood? That's kind of gone up a little, hasn't it? Okay. What about a bit about spending the night with relatives? That's gone up, especially over the last decade. But it had remained essentially the same even at the period when Robert Putnam was writing his book. So, is social capital maybe not so much on the decline as we thought? At least related to schmoozing, it seems like possibly the answer is yes.
Now, there's an elephant in the room if you look at this graph, and that is the year 2021 and 2022. There is a huge drop there. But what were those the years of? Those were the years of enforced and highly encouraged isolation, in which we were told by the United States government to spend less time in bars with neighbors, with relatives, with friends. And it looks as though, especially in 2021, and then to a certain extent in 2022, the last year of GSS data that we have available as of the recording of this video, people responded. That's a temporary blip, though, in what otherwise is remarkable stability.
But what about Maine in particular? One of the things that's really cool is that Robert Putnam has taken the data from Bowling Alone, and he's made some of it available at bowlingalone.org/data.htm. That's a website. You can see it down here at the bottom. Pause the video, write it down. You can go check out some of this data yourself. I've gotten some data. The GSS data comes from another place. The General Social Survey is a nationally representative survey that's carried out every few years, and it has been since 1974. Really cool. And that data is also publicly available. Come see me in office hours if you'd like to play with it. But a nice thing that they've done at bowlingalone.org, the website to support this book, is that they've created a 50-state social capital index. Actually, there are a few states that are left out. Hawaii seems to be left out of the mix. Maybe they had some difficulty collecting statistics. But what they do is they combine 14 indicators. Some of them are survey responses, like I spend a lot of time visiting friends, I feel most people can be trusted, most people are honest. They also take a look at the number of civic and social organizations per 1,000 population in the state, the number of group memberships, the average number of times volunteered in the last year, the turnout in presidential elections, all indications of some kind of schmoozing or some kind of mocking. The number of nonprofit organizations per 1,000 population, which is a little bit curious that they're including that in there, because Putnam was, just a few pages ago, who was discounting them as paper organizations. But okay, it's just one of 14 indicators, and overall you can try to rank these states. Now think about which states you think would be high in social capital, which states would be low. Where do you think Maine fits? Pause the video for a second, think about it. You think it's going to be high in social capital or low in social capital? Let's find out. The index, by the way, goes, I believe, from -2 to +2. There's some negative numbers. That means low social capital, low responses on these 14 indicators. There can be high responses as well, indicating that people tend to report high amounts of social capital. And there's Maine in blue. It has a positive number. It's not as positive as some others, like Iowa, Minnesota, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Vermont, one of our near neighbors, but it is fairly high. If you take a look, it just surpasses 0.5. How many other states do that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It's one of the top 13. So in fact, it kind of is number 13 in the list. And there are a lot of states that are lower. Maine does pretty well. There are a lot of states that do really poorly. Mississippi, Nevada, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama. If you think about some of those states, and no offense to people living in those states, but collectively speaking, they have a poor outcome. If you think about Alabama and you think about Mississippi, there are higher infant mortality rates, life expectancy is lower, social capital is lower as well. That's a little bit curious. You might start to want to think about that question now. Why is it that social capital is low? Because once you start to ask the question about in different places, in different states or different cities, towns, communities, why social capital can be high, why it can be low, you can think about why that happens, and you can think about what the outcome would be.